zeigst auch dann nicht so schnell.
We have the pleasure to welcome David Williams. He is actually at the moment not in Sydney but in Melbourne, and he gives us takes us to his work and gives us some impressions of his work, and then we can talk about this. And while we are talking about this, we have a special guest from Sydney, actually at the moment here in Germany. It's Ulrike Garde, and she will tell us how the connection from THEATERWELTEN to Australia, how it came to this point, because for us it's the very first time that we have partners in Australia as guests in THEATERWELTEN, and we are very happy about this. So I'll be quiet and give the floor to David. He will actually introduce himself because he can do it much better than me. David, please, the floor is yours.
Danke. Good morning over in Germany and elsewhere in the world. It is in the evening here in Melbourne and quite cold. So it's very nice to be at least seeing warm at the other end of the camera. Thank you very much to THEATERWELTEN and the Shopfront for the invitation to be here today. I am a theatre maker based in Melbourne these days, though originally from Sydney. I've worked with Shopfront a few times as a mentor with a number of their artists, helping them make their own shows. But my background over the last 25 years or so is as a theatre maker, largely working with various kinds of documentary or real-world materials. This has taken a number of forms over the years, and I just thought today I would talk about a range of these works and speak to some imagery of those works. So, if I may share my screen, I will play a little slideshow that I have made for you. I started many of these. The path that my career took has been largely by accident, I'll say. I hadn't intended to build a career making performance works or theatre works from various kinds of documentary materials. It was an accident. I had a colleague at the University of Sydney, Dr. Paul Dwyer, who I ran into a corridor one day, and he said, "You must make a show with this." And he handed me 20 pages of a Senate inquiry. So it was an inquiry into a very notable political scandal from 2001 in Australia. It was the so-called Children Overboard affair of 2001, where it was alleged by the Australian government that refugees had been deliberately throwing their children overboard in order to blackmail us decent Australians with our own decency, and then force the Royal Australian Navy to rescue them. It turned out that this event didn't happen, but it gained the government at the time lots of votes in the election, which they won quite comfortably. So I started reading this material, and my company at the time, a company called Version 1.0, transformed this inquiry, which was about 2,200 pages long, into a show called CMI, A Certain Maritime Incident. And there we are, looking very young. The show worked quite seriously with the inquiry. It was largely a a party political struggle between the government, the newly elected government, and the opposition. They played lots of semantic games throughout the inquiry, trying to define what words meant at various times. And so there was a great interest in this work in truth and the malleability, I suppose, the ways in which truth can be bent and twisted in various ways. And this performance constantly revolved around the idea of what was true and what was merely theatre. And so we adopted a whole range of very old technologies, from overhead projectors. At various times, the actors, when they changed roles within the show, would stand in front of overhead projector slides in order to declare their new identity. We asked various questions of ourselves throughout the show about representation, about whether we were good enough performers to be able to play these roles of these powerful politicians. We engaged in quite a lot of slapstick and physical comedy, particularly around events that at times were very serious, and there was a lot of word games in the inquiry, which we very much embraced. There's a younger version of me with less hair playing the commander of the naval frigate, the HMAS Adelaide, who intercepted the boat in question. So lots of physical comedy strategies throughout that. It was much to our surprise, it was a very successful work and kind of set a path for the next decade or so of the kind of work that we would make. So we were very interested in truth. We were very interested in the way in which truth was misused by those in power, and we investigated this through a range of shows that explored, that worked with government inquiries of various kinds. This is at the very end of the show, CMI. The end of the show is an account read by a computer of survivor testimony from a boat that actually sank, that wasn't examined by the inquiry. The inquiry focused on this event that did not happen. So this was a very successful show in 2004, and consequently we continued our investigations of truth, power, and governmental accountability. The Wages of Spin was our next project in 2005, and then we put a revised version of it that toured across Australia in 2006. The Wages of Spin was about the selling of the war in Iraq. So again, it was based on documentaries material, in this case lots of interviews with politicians in the lead up to the war in Iraq in 2003, and the ways in which the justifications for that war shifted and changed depending on who was asking the questions. We got very interested in various framing. Framing was a very, very strong interest in this. The performers worked with various, again, old technology, but used in new ways, I suppose. These are all analog cameras that are dotting the stage. It was set up like a live TV studio, and we would lay politicians speaking against striking imagery. In this case, this is the Australian Minister of Defence being walked blindfolded through a field of nails. He is actually blindfolded. The nails are real. Whilst speaking an inquiry transcript from Australian Parliament. And the camera follows his foot in extreme close-up. So the audience has to balance whether or not they can listen or watch or both, which was a challenge. So we constantly adopted new identities through the show. In this case, in this scene, I'm playing the Prime Minister of Australia. I got to play the Prime Minister of Australia, John Howard, who was a Conservative politician, quite a number of times over the years. And there I am being interviewed by multiple actors when we cut together a whole bunch of different press conferences. We're very interested in background and foreground, etc. So the work was quite playful. It was very visually rich environment, and yes, we continued this with a show called Deeply Offensive and Utterly Untrue, which is a quote from the then Australian Foreign Minister, Alexander Downer, who, for those of you who are interested in international news, he's been in the news recently as being the whistleblower that identified the FBI to the Trump campaign, wanting to gain dirt for WikiLeaks on Hillary Clinton. But Alexander Downer is a Conservative politician in Australia, now retired. He said in a letter to the Sydney Morning Herald, a major newspaper in Australia, that any suggestion that Australia went to war in Iraq to protect its wheat market is deeply offensive and utterly untrue. Of course, Australia was found to have paid substantial amounts of bribes to the government of Saddam Hussein in contravention of UN sanctions in the lead up to that war. And this was the subject of several international inquiries and one large inquiry in Australia. This was the so-called inquiry into certain Australian companies in relation to the UN Oil for Food program, or in Australia was mostly referred to as the Wheat for Weapons scandal. And again, in this show, we were very interested in truth and lies, and the first lie in the show, of course, is that this video screen that says every word in this performance is true. Of course, the performance is filled with lies. They just happen to be spoken by people in public who had powerful positions. Doesn't mean they were telling the truth, but these words were truly spoken. So this was our first work that we made in Carriage Works, which is in Sydney. It's a very large ex-industrial space, and we had a lot of fun playing with the whole space. This became our home for a number of years. So we got very interested in truth and lies. This particular sequence is quite early in the show. This is the managing director of Australian Wheat Board, or AWB, who spent 3 days giving testimony where he gave several hundred versions of the phrase, "I don't know, I don't recall." He subsequently received a very large payout from when he departed the Australian Wheat Board, and answered almost no questions. So again, we got interested in the corporate malfeasance, the corruption scandal around that show, around that scandal, up against the war that was being supported by money from Australia. We got interested again in the materiality of what we were talking about. It was wheat. Oh, my almost 2-year-old has come to say hello. Large scale visual imagery. The language in the show was all drawn from public statements of politicians and powerful people, and there was a range of video imagery around that, and including a live mouse, again followed on extreme close up. Yes, and there's me again forming in that show. This kind of ruckus kind of marked a bit of a shift for the company, and when we were again very interested in truth, and we were very interested in accountability, but it became much more personal. So the work was essentially about power control and violence in intimate relationships, and it was inspired by a series of sexual assault scandals involving public figures, mostly football players. But rather than the work being about football players and bad behaviour, it became about gender power more generally, and we very much put ourselves into this work. This was a very imagistic work, again working at Carriage Works in Sydney. So very large scale imageries, a lot of camera work in extreme close up, a lot of looped and repeated imagery in the show, and again, this was much more abstract for us, but again a very kind of powerful work that felt very personal at the time. This is in 2009. The various sequences in the show drew upon couples therapy. There is a range of references to real world sexual assault scandals, but a lot of the content in the show is actually drawn from personal experiences from the performers in their own relationships and moments where they have been guilty or potentially guilty of crossing lines of appropriate behaviour at various points in their lives, in our lives. And there's me looking quite menacing at that in that show. So the show had a series of loops in it, the same things repeated with and without this enveloping bubble wrap set. In later work called the Disappearances Project, this was a project about people who had not people who had disappeared, but people left behind in the event of a long-term missing persons case. And in this project, we found. Sorry, now my cat is starting up. Sorry, my apologies for the meowing in the background. In this project, we drew upon some staging ideas that came from the material itself. So in all these interviews with people left behind when a person goes missing, they talk about a whole series of things at the same time. They talk about being stuck, about being frozen, being paralysed and unable to move on. But at the same time, they constantly see the missing person out of the corner of their eye. And so we got very interested in this duality. In this performance, there are two actors, and they stay seated the entire show. They barely move in the show, which becomes extremely uncomfortable. The show is about an hour long. They stand up once, and their movements are very carefully calibrated. But at the same time, behind them, there's a continuous tracking camera shot out of a car window, which we almost see people constantly throughout the show. And it's the journey of the camera through the work goes from twilight to dawn over the course of the show. So they traverse a country town at night, Quiet Faith, I will wrap up very shortly, Stefan. The Quiet Faith is a show that I made in 2014, as it says. This is, again, based on interviews, in this case with Australian Christians who had, I suppose, an embrace of progressive politics. For this work, I was very interested that most of the publicly identified voices, the people who would speak loudly in public about being Christian, were very intolerant. They were very, they were anti-refugees. They were anti-feminist. They weren't people who talked about love very much, and that was in stark contrast to the Christians that I knew personally. And so I thought, well, I want to talk to those people and find out how their values are different to these other people who claim to be Christians. This was a very immersive work. It's performed for a very intimate audience. So this is the set for that show, designed by a beautiful designer named Jonathan Oxlade. He's based in Adelaide. So the audience actually sits in this, and the performers, the two performers in this show, work around the audience. So it's, again, very intimate, very, very COVID unfriendly. This show could never be made now in the current pandemic, because you have to get far too close to people. And it had you can see there's horn speakers around the edges of the space. So it had 10 speakers that enveloped the audience. And it was a work punctuated by stillness, very, very beautiful, very, very quiet work, much like the name might suggest. There are the performers in the work. Sadly, it was difficult to photograph this with an audience because it was a very intimate show. And that's the other performer, Ashton Malcolm, in that show, mid-song, in a kind of moment of rapture, I suppose. And then the last show I'll talk about today, this morning for you, is Grace Under Pressure. Again, an interview-based work, this time about workplace cultures in hospitals. So myself and my colleague Paul Dwyer interviewed a range of doctors and nurses working in hospitals about bullying, harassment, and teaching by humiliation. So the kinds of overwork, burnout, and stresses of health workers. And this show has just finished a tour around Australia 2 weeks ago. So this is the 2021 cast performing the show in Bendigo, which is in regional Victoria. And this is the wonderful actor Sal Shirar, who's in that show. Yes, Tanya Schneider and Emily Taylor from that show. So this is the most recent project in that vein that I've made. I've talked very fast. My apologies for that. I will now try and find my cursor to stop the share, and I can very happy to answer questions on any of that, and I hope that made sense to our viewers out there. It's a very quick overview of a range of work over a 20-year period.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. It was really it was impressive, and of course it was a lot of information. So, but really, really interesting. Before we come to maybe some questions from the chat, I would like to ask you as well. Maybe I go back to the first works, and because they are dealing with something we have, and as I see that you also have this wording, alternative facts. This is a hot topic in Germany right now. It's a political term, of course, and it's but it's influencing our society in the way we are meeting or being a community or not. And my question is, how did the audience deal with this alternative facts regarding the point that you're, it's like a double. It's theater is always pretending some kind of truth, and everybody knows it's not a lie, but it's a game, it's a play. And and then you're doing this also with the content of the performance, this switching between truth and questioning this truth and lies. How did the audience react? Was it more supporting, or were they offended by being confronted with this? Truth and lies.
We don't hear you.
Muted. So sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Audience reactions are always complicated because audiences are never singular. The CMI show in 2004, it was a really interesting case because it was well known that it was well known that the scandal was based on a series of untruths or a series of failures to correct the public record around what was true or not. And so, of course, most people in our audience were very aware that we were talking about untruths. And we were quite playful with our jumping in and out of truth and our kind of demonstration of our own limited capacity to convey various kinds of truths. And that was quite enjoyable and quite pleasurable for many audience members. We also did have a large number of the politicians who appear in the inquiry attend the show, which was quite interesting as well. And we tried to make within the project, within the performance, a range of challenges, both to ourselves and to our audience, to not get too comfortable, not think that just because these are untruths, and we know that we are not the senators who appear in the inquiry, is one of the lines in the show. We make various comparisons to the actor playing one of the senators is a woman, and the actor and the senator is not a woman. These are very playful moments, but there's a series of moments within that show where those the capacity to be comfortable is disrupted quite radically, and they are at the beginning and the end, particularly in that work. There is an expectation of the audience for that work at the time that they were going to see a show about a Senate inquiry. It will be physically safe. It'll be about politicians lying, and don't all politicians lie. So there is a kind of a degree of comfort to that, not as citizens, of course, but as audience members. But the show actually begins. The audience have to step over the bodies of all of the actors in the show, who are lying on the floor, prepared as if for mortuary storage. So in order to get to the show, which is about a rhetorical struggle between very comfortable politicians, white Australian powerful people, in order to get to that, you have to literally walk over bodies. And I do remember, because I was a performer in that show, I do remember lying on the floor, because we were lying there for about 15 minutes. And some of the politicians from the actual show, from the actual inquiry, the real inquiry, kind of walking over us and talking about us. So there is this kind of fascinating doubling, of course, both within the show and around the show. So in order to get to this very safe, comfortable set of arguments, we have to literally ignore the bodies of people that we allowed to die on our watch. And unfortunately, Australia is still very much aggressively hostile to asylum seekers. And that's kind of where it began for us, unfortunately. And Australia has not changed, sadly.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's kind of hopefully answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you very much. What's very interesting, and maybe you did. My question is also about this performance, or the question is: Do you often use comedy as a moment of breaking the expectation of the audience? Like the topics are quite serious, and you pointed out that you always try to, as I understood, to make clear the playful moments are very important for like theater as a tool or a device, but especially comedy. Is this something you use just in this performance, or is it something you're using more than in just this performance? Sorry, my English is.
No. Your English is much better than my German. So
thank you.
Thank you. Each of those works based on inquiries, with all of those works, there was at least one, and often multiple moments where the performers themselves grapple or try and struggle to understand what the show is talking about, and those moments are often quite funny, and they became more and more over the years that we were making these kinds of shows. They became more and more pronounced, and they became more and more about us, because we were ordinary. In some ways, we were ordinary Australian citizens trying to understand these complex scandals, because these works are all about scandals. We were trying to understand these complex events, which powerful people deliberately made very complicated in order to confuse, in order to make us not think about them very hard. But often we liked to stage our own struggle to understand, and it was often the struggles weren't. They were quite genuine. So, in Deeply Offensive and Utterly Untrue, for instance, our show about the wheat board inquiry, that was a ridiculously complicated scandal involving a whole range of shell companies. That there was a very complicated corporate scandal that entangled various members of government, and the whole thing was very deliberately designed to be very complicated, so ordinary citizens would exhaust their capacity for outrage. And so yes, absolutely, we tried to make it as funny as possible. Our regular narrator kind of figure for that show was Alexander Downer, who is somewhat of a clownish figure for those of you out there who want to look him up. He is a very clownish figure. We would do, everywhere we performed that, we would interview him. The show is punctuated by a series of interviews with Alexander Downer on public television, where he's asked to explain the events that happened over the last couple of days, and he does it spectacularly badly. But he always would end on a line that says, "Oh, it's terribly complicated," which became our kind of refrain for the show. So we would do each of those interviews. We restaged them as a live cross to the bar in the theatre. So our Alexander Downer was always interviewed with a glass of wine live at the actual theatre bar where we were playing the show. So the audience would recognise where they had been before they'd come into the show. So yeah, there was always some comedic moments, and they were very important, both in the audience journey of the show, but also for us as a political tool for us to implicate ourselves in various ways.
Okay, so thank you. Maybe I'm gonna ask Darina before I'm just talking to you. So,
do we have any questions?
Do we have any questions?
We have one question. Yes, we have a couple of. Am I correct that the actors in your performances are the young people from Shopfront between 8 and 25? Is it right, or?
Not in any of the works that I've talked about this morning. So I have often worked with Shopfront and other companies that work with young artists. So because of my background and experience in working with real world kind of true materials in various ways, I have worked with younger artists to help them find ways of working with biographical or non-fiction materials. So recently with Shopfront, I was working with a young artist who wanted to make a project exploring his own experiences working as a sex worker in a male sex worker in a small town in Australia, and so we were working. I was helping him shape his autobiographical material and layering a bunch of physical routines from his work he was working as a stripper and exotic dancer, and so we were working strategies to overlay these physical routines that are also part of his experience in that work, alongside shaping autobiographical material. So that's one example of a project that I've done with younger artists, working with Shopfront particularly. There is another similar to Shopfront company in Newcastle, which is north of Sydney, called Tantrum. I've worked on several projects for Tantrum. Most recently, a project I worked with a group of young women, and there was a project called Sorry to Cut You Off, Penny. And this was a project that we built from a series of conversations. So over many months, we documented them talking about their everyday lives and their sense of frustration with the way, with their circumstance, and we turned all of those conversations, we shaped those into an election night dinner party for the 2019 federal election in Australia, which the Conservative government at the time won that election, which is they were widely expected to lose, and so it becomes a night. It's framed as a night where it's excitement. It's exciting. The government is going to lose tonight, and then of course they win, and so our group of young women having their vegetarian feast, the tone changes as the election night continues. So I have worked with young artists in a range of contexts, but with all those works, I've been very much led by the desires and the subject matter that the young artists themselves want to explore. So I've only talked about my own practice that I've been working as a lead artist, but I often work to support younger artists with these other companies to make their works as well. I hope that addresses that question.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the question was actually because I suppose the audience in the YouTube chat out there, they would like to focus more on the young people and how you work with the young people, and maybe you can also say a couple of words about the culture identities or that present in the work with the young participants, if you experience this. Did you catch the question, or I was a bit confused in my reading the question?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, look, most youth theatres in Sydney in particular, like Shopfront, have very diverse, so their young performers are of a wide range of cultural backgrounds. Australia is a very culturally diverse place. So I'm mainly working with non-fiction or real stories in various ways, and so the projects that I'll work on will have a theme. I worked on a project with young people in 2012 called The Tender Age, in which we worked on stories of young people, relationships and technology. So we were looking at inappropriate sharing of sexual videos, or so-called sexting, which is the distribution of naked photos, and etc., and the ways in which these navigated in school environments, again, this was drawing on the real world experiences of the young people and shaping that by using video and various physical strategies. So we worked with kind of overlaying various dance routines onto intercutting those dance routines with short stories that in some way reflected lots of different experiences of the subject matter. which came from the actual lives of the participants. I suppose their cultural background in terms of ethnicity was less relevant to their lived experience in relation to the subject matter, if that's helpful.
Yes, I think it's, all the questions, because actually, if I keep an eye on our timer, we don't have much time for...
Yes. Sorry, I didn't keep an eye on that. So yeah, because I was so fascinated about all the projects David gave us examples. Thank you very much. For me, it was very impressive. I could have more than 1 hour of questions, but so thank you very much.